All right, whenever you're ready.
Okay, go ahead.
Okay. Well, thank you all for being here. I'm glad to be able to present. As long as my voice holds up, um, we'll go through this. For those of you who don't know me, been a member of MHA, I don't know, 10, 15 years. Um, I come from a mining background. My father was a geologist and president of a mining company for a number of years. So I've got mining in my blood. When I was in college, um, I ended up at the Newberry in Chicago. It was a phenomenal place to do research, and the Comstock was where I started. Went to grad school at University of Iowa. Worked with Mac Robaugh. Um, Thoroughly enjoyed it, but did not finish a PhD for a variety of reasons, um, largely the job market. So when I ended up presenting at the Mining History Association in Virginia City in 2015, um, Eric Nystrom approached me and he said, "You ought to write a book." And I said, "Eric, most of my research is 50 years old." And he said, "Well, nobody's been doing it." And that's not true anymore. Certainly because of Ron's book, Ron James's book. Um, but I currently have a proposal in front of the University of Nevada Press, and we'll keep our fingers crossed with that. Um, Want to talk about a couple of things regarding Virginia City, and this is not all of my research. It's just an overview of two areas that I think are really interesting to people. Um, so we'll move on. Um, Talk about competing images of Virginia City, a little bit of geology and some history, and then two parts of that history that I find really interesting. Um, a lot of what most people know about Virginia City comes from these two television shows. 1950, 431 episodes for Bonanza, um, 18 years worth of Death Valley days. And I have to tell you, since my father worked for US Borax for a number of years, we watched Death Valley days quite religiously. Um, when you think about images of Virginia City, if you stroll down C Street, you'll hear about the saloons and the prostitutes and the murders. And the fudge shops and the curios. Um, but historians have taken a more detailed look at things. Ron Paul, or Rodman Paul, in 1963, in what was really a groundbreaking book, talks about the free spending and instability of Virginia City, but he uses the term industrial city. And I'll get back to that in a little bit. Ron James, in what is a superb book, um, talks at some length about the boom and bust, the torrent of people coming and going, and talking about mining being a transient, unfinished kind of thing. Um, and I'm not sure how accurate that is, but I will say that this quote from James's book is right on target. Um, Virginia City, the cities on the Comstock, more like industrial cities than anything in the West. And I think part of what's going on here is that in the American West, you had these ephemeral mining camps that may have lasted a season if they were lucky. And you had communities that lasted 10, 15 years, sometimes not even that long. And then you had a small number of industrial cities. Um, and when I started looking at the history of the Comstock, things didn't add up, given that this is a community of 12 to 25,000 people with a really rich, diverse social community structure. So spent a lot of time working with it. If you've seen photographs of Virginia City, this is Carlton Watkins, 1877. This is a city. This isn't a camp. And the scale of the mining was phenomenal. Hundreds and hundreds of miles of adits and tunnels and drifts and winzes and so forth. Workings as deep as 3,400 feet. A whole bunch of what people call third line shafts, very expensive, dug in an effort to reach the lode at 3,000 feet or more. 2,000 to 3,000 miners in the space of this 5 or 6 miles. Just, a pretty amazing mining district. A little bit of orientation for people who aren't familiar. This is north is to the right. The lode, the major, most productive part of the lode encompasses the south end mines, in red, the middle mines, and the north end mines. The most famous of the north end mines, of course, being the California and the Consolidated Virginia. And if you notice, following my arrow here, all of these shafts that are half a mile or more from the where the lode surfaces, these are the third line shafts, and some pretty amazing engineering here. The geology, this is the lode is an epithermal silver and gold deposit, primarily silver, roughly 14 million years old. It's fault controlled. The ore bodies are in the fault zone, north-south strike, east-west dip. And the two, I don't know, two of the best resources for the geology itself are Becker's report in 1882 and Berger et al. A paper in economic geology in 2003. Let's move into the 19th century. Miners had been working the relatively poor placers of Gold and 6 Mile Canyon since the early 1850s, and most of the gold in the lode is a millimeter or less in size, according to most of the geology reports. But by 1859, they got to the head of the canyon, discovered these incredibly rich outcrops. The damn blue stuff, the silver ores, were a real problem for them. I mean, they're still trying to pan and recover not $2,000 to $3,000 a ton, but minuscule amounts. Anyway, the rush is on. And by 1864, you have industrial scale mining in a city of 12,000. And this is an important point because very quickly the individual claimants sold their claims to mining companies, and having an orderly town with good legal support, police, et cetera, was really pretty important if they were going to be successful. And if any of you have read McDonald's very recent book called We the Miners, she talks a lot about the lawless, meaning no formal law in California during the early parts of the gold rush, but the miners themselves really putting together a legal system. 1869, second year of a downturn in terms of production. 1870, 1871, some new bonanzas, so additional income. And I should note here, I'm combining Virginia City and Gold Hill as an urban area and calling them one industrial city. 1871, 73, couple small bonanzas, and then the big bonanza. And this is really where Virginia City gets its name and gets its reputation. By 1875, probably 25,000 people, miners and families working there. 1875, in addition to being a high point, the city burned, a large part of it burned. And what's interesting about this is that, like most cities in the 19th century that burned, people are rebuilding almost immediately. So Virginia City comes back looking even more sophisticated and more substantial than it was. 1878, things start to slow down. The stock market in San Francisco collapses because people are worried that the big bonanza is indeed running out. The third line shafts, however, are well underway. And a number of geologists are saying, the lode is going to continue at depth and be precisely what it was near the surface. This gave the mine owners, and the stock speculators and the investors the motivation to really continue exploration, continue to pay the assessments, and at the same time return to some of the lower grade ores near the surface. 1880, just a nice point to sort of touch base. A second downturn. The stock market collapses again. The census reports that about a third of the miners are unemployed at this point, partly because there was no water in the Carson River to run the mills. And this would happen both spring and fall, sometimes for weeks. The mines didn't have a lot of space to store ore, and so shutting the mills down was the option. Three pictures here, the three major shafts, third line shafts, and their pumps. I'm convinced that the top pump there on the Union shaft probably was the largest pump in the world. People in Iron Mountain will claim that their pump is, but the cylinders here are bigger. Anyway, the combination shaft, the third picture here, is the deepest in the world at this point. In the 1880s, the mines continued to recover low-grade ore and levy assessments, anywhere from 2 to 4 million a year. Exploration goes to at least 3,400 feet. And the payrolls on the mines approach the bonanza days of the middle and late 1870s. Officially, or not officially, R.L. Polk estimates the population at 15,000. I'm guessing that's just Virginia City, and it's probably higher. Pumping, water's a huge issue on the lode, as many of you know. The South End mines stopped pumping in 1882, including that massive pump at the Yellow Jacket. The North End mines stopped in 1884. And in 1886, the combination shaft stops. And if you read the journal articles in October of 1886, the trade publications were calling this the death knell, the final days of the Comstock. But things continued. $7.5 million in 1888. And like I said, things continued. One of the questions, and my father actually asked me this, and he said, well, weren't there any geologists? Didn't they know how to how to find the ore. Why did they spend so much time? Well, remember 1870, geologists didn't really understand hydrothermal deposits, and certainly not how the ore bodies in the lode were distributed or why. So they had to dig a tunnel to get there. And if you look at the underground maps, there are lots of tunnels. But the water was a really a big issue. And when you're single jacking or double jacking, you can get 6 feet, 5 feet ahead of the face of the tunnel. And if you hit water, it's a mess. So they started using diamond drills in the late 1870s, to find water. They're not doing diamond core drilling, primarily because the load material doesn't really lend itself to being cored easily. But by 1880, you do see diamond core drilling. If you look at the Becker map here at the left on the screen, those thin lines going north and south, to the north of the CNC shaft, those are diamond drill holes. 20 years later, the Haste map of 1900, again, diamond drill holes. So these get used more often, and I've seen some reports of assays in the 90s and onward, as they continue to search for ore. Production gradually in the 1890s decreases. They attempt to start pumping the mines again. The Ward shaft gets reopened. The Comstock Pumping Association forms. End up with a lot of small discoveries. Recover 7 million in ore, or in gold, silver and gold, but spend another 5 million in assessments. So this is really, as I have come to think of it, it's an industrial city. And one of the pieces of context here is that from 1860 to 1900, America's population really shifted from agrarian to urban, from agricultural efforts to manufacturing and commercial stuff. There are only 94 cities above 10,000 in 1860, 210 in 1880, over 400 in 1900. And here's the one that really drives it home to me. By 1870, the population of Virginia City was 11,300, and this is the official population. That made it the third largest city between Denver and San Francisco. Now, Denver's only just under 5,000. Salt Lake City's 12,000. Sacramento, 16,000. San Francisco, of course, is a lot bigger than this. So let's look a little bit further into the economy of this city. There are a couple of things that historians use to sort of as indicators. I'll look at a number of them going forward. This graph, which is a little bit dated because I need to update it for population. I've got much better information about population now. But you can see that indeed there's a boom and bust in terms of the amount of gold and of silver and gold that comes out of the ground. The amount of ore hoisted also goes up and down. The population stays fairly constant. And one of the things I'm doing now is collecting yearly payroll numbers and also the assessment numbers, because they're driving the analysis of a page, 2 pages further down. Occupational structure is an interesting way of looking at a community. This is just Virginia City. This is from my work that would have been a dissertation. Although the population changes over time, the occupational structure, who's doing what in the community, doesn't change. Between 20 and 30% of the workers are miners, or excuse me, between 30 and 40 are miners. And this doesn't change. And it's so constant that statistically these are essentially identical populations. So there's a stability of the occupational structure that's actually kind of interesting. Also, probably not surprising, because this is a mining town. This is an industrial city focused on mining, extractive industry, and that's all that happens. The real question is, how much did the mines spend in the local economy? And the answer here is to look at the assessments. The assessments paid for not only the normal operations of the mines, but they paid for prospecting, the effort that was expended that consumed millions of dollars. Look at the Ophir, for instance, $1.5 million in dividends, almost $5 million in assessments. The Golden Curry last dividend was 1871, but Fair and Flood and O'Brien and Mackey sucked another $6.5 million from investors and stockholders to keep the Golden Curry exploration working. The third line shafts, of course, were incredibly expensive. I looked at, because there are enough annual reports for mines through 1873, I could look at actually what was spent on mine operating costs. And you'll see the last column there ranging anywhere from 8.1 million down to about 4.4 million a year. This is enough for 2,000 or more miners and surface workers on an annual basis. 1877 to 1878, $11 million in assessments. And then Grant Smith talks about 40 million in assessments between 1878 and 1888. And I'm not quite sure his numbers are completely accurate, but I'm certainly working on nailing those down. So the stability of the economy becomes a really interesting aha. You're spending $4 million a year in the mines that goes into the local economy. Those wages support quite a stable population, and also support a really vibrant industrial metropolis. Not really unlike most industrial cities in the East, except for the population that has more single males in it. The stability of the economy has a couple of interesting implications. There's virtually no occupational mobility. You came here to work. You didn't come here to get rich and move up the occupational ladder. Because there wasn't any occupational mobility, the young people left. And as I do community and economic development work in 21st century Minnesota, you see the same thing in small towns and in larger towns where the economy is either perfectly stable or questionable. Young people leave. There are no opportunities for them. But the people who did stay stayed in significant numbers. These numbers are actually higher than some eastern cities. The interesting thing about Virginia City is the residential mobility. If you stayed in Virginia City and you moved up the hill. If you know the geography, the topography of Virginia City, the better neighborhoods are further up the slopes of Mount Davidson. The population becomes increasingly Irish, which is not, in some ways, not surprising. This is an eye chart. This is what most industrial cities would have in terms of businesses, amenities, organizations, etc. A coffee shop, a whole bunch of hospitals and 9 churches, sewer system, a gas system, a water system, a very functional pair of city governments.
14 looks like it might have been about the 15. So
I'm sorry, what? I didn't hear that comment. Okay. And cities have children. Joe Curtis, who's a good friend of mine from Virginia City, and I just love working with historic photographs. And there, you get pictures of kids in many times. And not surprisingly, there were 6,300 kids in the late 1870s, 6,300 children. So this is an industrial city. Its economic function is as a producer. It's a mining town. It's regionally, if not nationally, important, and this is again unique in terms of mining communities, other than the really big ones. Machinery comes from San Francisco, the wood and water from the Sierras, financial services from San Francisco. And a lot of urban historians will talk about stability in cities. They persist despite transients. They persist despite disasters. And they persist because of a very robust social fabric. Again, as I do economic development work in the 21st century, it's this informal power structure that's really very significant. I want to talk a little bit about saloons real quickly. First episode of Bonanza takes place in part in the Sazerac Saloon on C Street. So they tried, both Bonanza and Death Valley Days did try to be somewhat historically accurate. There were indeed 100 saloons. But one of the interesting things about saloons in the mid and late 19th century is that they are third spaces. They're social spaces beyond drink and food for a population of single men in these cities. In Virginia City and Gold Hill, a couple of really large saloons, but a much larger group of small saloons that were the front room of a house or a small house, sometimes offering food, often with a boarding house. If you see the photograph in the lower left, this building is the saloon and boarding house at 545 Main. The proprietors were often women, either women married to miners or other laborers. This is a little extra income, or widows. And one of the things I'm really interested in, having looked at things like the Dun and Bradstreet credit reports, these are really sketchy businesses economically. A lot of bankruptcies, a lot of changes in ownership. And so, like I said, really kind of interesting. This is another eye chart. 110, 101 saloons in 1868, 101 in 1877, 152 a year later. City directories and the credit reporting agencies will report things differently. The interesting thing here is this is 6.5 to 7 saloons per 1,000 population, the same as Eastern industrial cities at the same time. If you look at maps of saloons in Pittsburgh, for instance, there's 6, 8, 10 in the block. And that's not much different than if you look at some of the maps on the Sanborn maps on the Comstock. Alcohol consumption probably much less than it was than it is today. And for the miners and other people who worked in the mines, Social control was a huge um, um, way of making sure that minors and most other people didn't get incredibly drunk. There was no way that your fellow minor or a mine superintendent would let a drunkard underground. Enough people died. I mean, there were many ways to die underground, and making a stupid mistake because you were drunk was not tolerated in any way, shape, or form. Um, last question here. Who got rich? And rich is an interesting term. Certainly, the miners and other people living in Virginia City enjoyed a stable life. The cost of living decreased. The quality of life as more and more trees get planted. It's probably, although in the winter it's damn cold, it was probably not a bad place to live. Good schools, etc. So for many people, this was a good life. And for Irish who'd come over in the 50s and 60s after the potato famine, this was nirvana in a lot of ways. Merchants did a good job, succeeded in many cases. Those who did often would retire to San Francisco. Many of them had business relationships with businesses in San Francisco, so that was a natural. One of the things I'm trying to do in this research is figure out where the people who left Virginia City, who left the Comstock, where they went. The 1880 census has a really nice volume that at the county level records the birthplace of the county residents. Now, if you were born in Nevada between 1860 and 1880, most likely you were born on the Comstock. And most of the Nevada-born kids in 1880 are in San Francisco. Some of them end up in Butte. Some of them end up in Leadville. That research is ongoing. And like I said, this is a city. I love the historic photographs. There are lots and lots and lots of single family and dual family housing. The people who got rich are the mill owners, okay, through stock manipulations and other shenanigans. Ron Lingenfelter has done a really nice job in his Gold Lust and Silver Sharks, talking about all the stock manipulations. But the other way that the mining directors made money was because they also owned the mills. And so, as this 1882 comment says, the mines would pull $20 ore out of the ground. They'd pay $25 a ton for extracting and reducing the ore. And the stockholders who lost in the mines, who lost $5 a ton through the assessments, the directors of the milling companies would make $5 or $6 a ton. And it was these assessments that kept things going. Mackey, Flood, Fair O'Brien owned the biggest milling company. They also owned the water, the railroad, and the lumber and fluming companies. They were quite vertically integrated. And the two things to note here, the first one is historians, I don't think, can judge motivation. But certainly what these guys were doing was really sketchy. There were a number of lawsuits, and it was really clear, even in the late 1870s and onward, that assessments were um, a sham in a lot of ways. The thing that its assessments supported was labor tranquility on the load. Miners on the load got $4 a day into the 1890s. And given labor tranquility, the Bonanza firm and the other mine owners could continue this game of stock manipulation and endless assessments, and walk away with small fortunes. Mackey was reported to be the second richest person in the 1890s in the U.S. So, what's the legacy here? Really interesting, I think, in a lot of ways. It's an industrial city, so in some ways, it's it's like other industrial cities. But what happened on the load was pretty important for mining. Dita Seimer and Square Set Timbering, Halliday and the hoisting cables, all sorts of underground technology for mine ventilation and drainage, and of course milling. Technology transfer is an interesting issue that I know Eric Nystrom's looked at, and I will probably look at. Most of the time, it appears that mining engineers visited the Comstock. I only know of 2 Comstock superintendents who took their expertise elsewhere. One goes to Broken Hill in Australia, and the other goes to the gold mines on the Rand in South Africa. And of course, Virginia City gets eclipsed pretty quickly by 1890. Butte is coming on the horizon. Butte by 1900 is 30,000. Leadville really never gets above about 15,000, but it's the other mining district. And also consider the Iron Range and the Keweenaw, much larger mining districts and also much larger in terms of people. So one of my questions is, I think about, again, doing community and economic development in Minnesota communities, is how do you recognize what happens in a community? How do you acknowledge the history of the people that worked in the lode? And at the same time, how do you put in perspective all of the colorful myths and misconceptions? The legacy of the Comstock is pretty complex, and I've only touched a couple parts of it. And with that, look forward to questions and comments.
Thank you very much, Hans. That's really nice. Okay, anyone else want to talk tonight? We're getting very quiet the last couple nuggets. Layla?
I was wondering to what extent Virginia City was affected by the Long Depression, or what was known as the First Great Depression, that commenced in 1873 but didn't hit the West Coast until a few years later.
Not impacted at all. In 1876 and 1877, the big bonanza is turning out $3 million in silver and gold a month. The economy was humming. The local economy was doing just fine. And all of the communities that relied on Virginia City, that provided the food and the wood and the manufactured goods, those were doing very well also. It's only 1878 when you have, and then 1880 again, when the stock market really crashes locally. And that's not related at all to the national economy at that point.
Okay, thank you.
Good question, though. Thank you.
Hans, what about the 1893 crash?
That's more substantial. I was blown away, though. I've been trying to recover payroll information. Payroll in for parts of 1893 and 1894, close to 200,000 a month. So the mining economy in Virginia City is still going. The devaluation of silver by the end of the 1890s does really impact because it makes it harder and harder to make money. And it's the motivation for trying to perfect things like cyanide processing to try to recover ore and also go after tailings. One of the tragedies of the Comstock is that you'd have ore that might during the big bonanza particularly, that might assay $300 a ton. They'd recover 200 of it, and the rest of it would go out in tailings. Pan amalgamation with mercury was not tremendously effective.
Okay, Brian?
Hey, Brian.
Hey, Hans, Brian Leach. Good to see you again. Hey, I was really interested in your discussion of the saloons as kind of third spaces, right? That they would be places, as much for socialization, and hence we wouldn't see kind of drunkenness outside of that, right? Like the point was more to kind of socialize. And I was kind of curious, like, are there is that the main reason why we have so many saloons around all these different industrial sites? I mean, were there other kinds of places people would be doing that kind of socialization? I mean, is that, are they just taking the place of a labor hall, or I don't know, wherever else you would go hang out?
So very good question, Brian. The one of the things that I did as I was putting together my book proposal was I said, what's the history of leisure in particularly late 19th century America? And the answer is there's not a lot. There's a guy by the name of Roy Rosenzweig, has a book called 8 Hours for What We Will. And when after the Civil War, as communities started to urbanize, saloons were the first institutions for single men. They often had boarding houses. They often had meals. It was a place for comradeship. And remember that beer particularly didn't have the alcohol content it does today. In mining camps where the water was bad, the beer was at least drinkable. By 1900, and Rosenzweig's pretty good about this, you have a lot of social organizations other than saloons that men can spend time in. And in Virginia City, you start to see train on the Comstock trains that will go down into the Washoe Valley, and there'll be day-long or 2-day-long picnics and sporting events and baseball games and things of this sort. But leisure for the single male, the opportunities grow very slowly. And that's why in Pittsburgh, for instance, even in 1900, I've got a map of one of the of a district in Pittsburgh. There are 15 saloons in every block. This is there weren't many other outlets. So I'm really interested in digging into this, pun intended.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, if I had a follow up, it would be, I mean, I've certainly heard that I mean, gambling was one of the kind of core pursuits in some of those saloons. Does that seem to be true? Do we have any evidence of that, or has that just become as much myth as it is reality?
I'm going to say myth at this point. $4 a day, 28, 29, 30 days a month. You had discretionary money. You probably did recreational gambling, not heavy duty. And again, I think the recreation part is more important than the get drunk, get in the gunfight with a card shark. Speculation in mining stock was probably more endemic as a gambling effort, because all sorts of people bought stock, and those who were local had the faith that, oh, there'll be another bonanza, because there was. I mean, the original bonanzas peter out in 67, in 69, 70, and 73. You get new ones, and they're richer than the first ones. And then you get the big one in 75 and 73. And then you get these little ones in the 80s and 90s. But as geologists today will tell you, epithermal precious metal deposits have a very finite horizon within a fault zone. And so, no, there's nothing below 3,000 feet. There's at the foot of the combination shaft, they found 100-foot diameter, $20 a ton ore, but most of the stuff is much shallower.
Okay, Jack Crawford?
Was there organized labor there?
Oh, yes. And again, Langenfelter has another book on organized labor. Miners' unions form between 63 and 68. You had to be a member. And the miners' unions served a couple of functions. You couldn't work in the mines unless you were a union member. You paid dues. And because you paid dues, if you were injured or killed, the miners' unions would take care of your widow. And so there are countless articles in the newspapers, benefit for Joe Smith, raised $1,100 for his widow and 2 children. And most of those benefits raised, $700 to $1,500. I've not seen one that the turnout was always really very good. So they were a trade union and a social insurance function. And the mine owners didn't make any attempt to break a union. There was some discussion in the early 1880s, but the mine owners and mill owners had a good thing going, so they didn't push too hard.
Any other questions, comments?
I'd like to ask about the churches. My great-grandmother was baptized at St. Mary's, and the Episcopal Church had a big presence with St. James. The Methodist must have been even a larger presence. Could you talk about the churches and the social fabric of an industrial city?
An integral part of the social fabric. women's organizations, as well as St. Mary's had a significant orphanage in town. They helped raise money for minors who were injured, in addition to the union, and they ran a school. A number of the picnics and other social gatherings in the late '60s onward are church related. So you'll get 2 trains worth of St. Mary's members going down to Washoe for the day, the Washoe Valley for the day, for a picnic. So they were critical parts of the social fabric. Yeah.
Well, thank you for a great presentation. Enjoyed it.
Thank you. Other questions? Another hand somewhere. Yeah.
Mike?
Yeah, your pictures of the Cornish pumps or the pumping engines in one of your slides just kind of struck a note with me, because tomorrow in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, or outside of Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, is going to be a historical marker dedicated to the President pump, which
Yes.
at the time in 1872 was supposed to be the largest 110-inch cylinder type pumping engine for the zinc mines that were in Friedensville. So there's a link on the Mining History Association webpage if you want to learn more about that. But
Yeah. I hesitate to use the term Cornish pump.
yeah, right.
The pumps that in Cornwall are plunger pumps. There's this long pump rod. The engines that drive those were nothing like most of the engines on the Comstock. I mean, they still relied on plunger pumps, on pump rods.
Yeah,
3,000 feet.
Yeah.
of Oregon pine, 18 inches square, in a pump rod. These are thousands of tons. And Bob Kendall, who my father worked for at U.S. Borax, Kendall's father was a mine superintendent on the Comstock. And Bob has an article in the Nevada Historical Society, late 1990s, and he talks about the failure of pumping, the mechanics of getting a pump, a rotary pump, a rotary engine, to translate that movement into up and down. Has all sorts of problems. When the Yellow Jacket pump, the one in the picture, when that pump rod broke in 1881, pieces of that flywheel, which were 30 feet in diameter, were thrown half a mile.
Yeah.
I mean, and a number of the pumps on the Comstock failed at various times because of broken pump rods. The president had a much smaller, much shallower shaft to deal with.
Yeah, absolutely. You're dealing with smaller depths and but pretty large volumes of water. The one in Friedensville was 25,000 rough. I think it was 17,000 gallons was the design capacity. 17,000 gallons a minute. And actually, when New Jersey Zinc was operating the mines there in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, they were pumping between 25 and 35,000 gallons of water a minute to keep the modern mines operating.
Yep.
But I just thought it was just sort of a coincidence seeing that. And also, those of us that went to Park City saw the terrific model they had at the Park City Museum of a very similar sort of pump with the angled cylinder.
Yes.
Yeah, Very,
And I haven't done a lot of research on that pump to know who the engineer was. The pumps on the Comstock end up designed, the two biggest ones are designed by William H. Patton, who was superintendent for the Bonanza firm. And it's the descriptions of the Union shaft and the Yellow Jacket clearly suggest that Patton was trying two different solutions to transferring reciprocating steam power to a pump rod.
yeah. Right.
Well, thank you very much, Hans.